So the first technique is actually a wet on wet technique, and it is a smooth blend. So in order to achieve a smooth blend in painting, you have to work fairly quickly because we do not want the paint to dry. So first things first, you're going to get a little paint in your brush. I'm going to paint a little bit of black on one side. Rinse out my brush. Dry it off. Paint my second color, whatever color I want to blend with the black. So let's say I want to do some red. Except that's a little dark. Let's add a little bit of white into it. Let's say I have this nice kind of pinkish red, and I want to blend it into my black. And I want to do a smooth blend. So the whole strategy to smooth blending, the trick is both of your colors have to be wet. So you can see my black paint is wet due to the glare that the light is shining off of it, and my light tint of red is wet as well. So you would want to clean out your brush, okay? And then what we're going to do here on the seam, we're going to drag some of the reddish pink over towards the black. Now if this black paint has already dried, which it kind of actually already dried up here at the top, you can see it's not blending, versus down here at the base, it's starting to mix in with the pink. And all I'm doing is kind of swirling my brush in a circle, and as I do that, the paint is actually going to mix and create a nice soft blend. Now if the paint has already dried, like you see up above here, you can see you're going to have a hard line in between your two colors. Okay, so you just kind of swirl it. Now if you want this transition a little smoother, you can always clean out your brush. Okay, and the key is a clean brush. And if there's a big jump here between this middle color and my light pink, I could always come in here, swirl it around some more before it dries to try to get a nice fading. Same thing here between my darks and my blacks. You just kind of have to work that paint in a little circle to blend it out. Okay, so it's the first technique, a smooth blend. Second technique is actually a blocking in technique, which should be a familiar term. That is the second step in painting, where we're painting huge hunks of color. So how this approach works, okay, same thing. It is a wet on wet technique, so I need to work fairly quickly. My black paint is wet. I'm going to mix the color I want to blend in with it. So let's say I want to mix this black in with a gray. Okay, so I have my gray going. I want to mix or transition from black to gray. So my first section between, I want to do a value between the two. So I'm going to mix kind of like a middle gray, plop it in between them. Okay, rinse out my brush. While the paint is still wet, I'm going to do that a second time. Now I'm going to try to get a value between my middle gray and my light gray. And I'm just going to smear it in between those two. And then I'm going to insert another gray between my middle gray and this one I just painted. And I'm really just creating a little value scale in between. And I'm trying to step it up slowly. And if you're very careful with your mixtures of your gray, you can see I'm just painting rectangles. I'm painting a straight line coming down, but since the paint is wet, it actually will get you a nice blend from dark to gray. Because as you stroke the gray in between the two colors, your brush is naturally going to mix them together. Okay, so that is blocking in. Really, I just did this with a series of 5 blocks. I did 5 rectangular strokes going down, and by doing that I made a nice blend. Okay, so that's my blocking in. That's my second technique. My third technique is stippling, Now stippling I like to do with a round brush. Okay, so I'm going to use my little cylindrical brush. I'm going to approach it the same way. I'm going to put my one color on one side, so I'm going to do black. And let's do yellow this time. Okay, you're going to be doing this with any color, every color. Okay, it doesn't really matter the color. We're just transitioning between two colors. Oops. Okay, so I have my two colors. They're both wet. Okay, you can tell by the shininess. Now what I'm going to do here, with my brush still full of yellow paint, I'm going to start to pull this yellow into my black, but stippling means dots. So as I pull it in, I'm actually going to blop or dot the paint. Notice I'm not stroking it across the paper, I'm actually tapping it. So I'm tapping the bristles, I'm pulling some of that yellow paint on my brush into the black, and you can see as I brush it or blop it into the black, my brush is picking up some of the black, which is what I want to happen, because once I bring the yellow into the black, now I'm going to start tapping the black into the yellow. So you bring the lighter color in first, and then you bring the darker color out after. And if you just kind of work on that seam by blopping it or tapping it, you're going to get a nice transition from one color to your next. Okay, so that's called stippling. Our next technique is called hatching. Okay, so starting off the same way. Have one color on one side. Rinse out my brush. Okay, I'm going to use yellow again. My second color next to it. Okay, hatching means using a series of lines. So instead of tapping it like I did with my stippling, I'm going to drag the brush. So I'm going to drag the yellow into the black while they're both wet. Pull some of the black into the yellow, some of the yellow into the black. Now I could do a series of lines going one direction. Okay, if I don't like the look of just going one direction, I could go multiple directions, like I'm cross hatching. And you can see that's a whole nother look. Okay, so depending on how you work the brush and the bristles, you're going to get different looks in your paint technique. Okay, so you can see just with those two going in one direction versus several directions. Looks kind of like stop motion, like something just flew off the page, compared to something that's pixelated or very computer-like. Okay, and that is all of the techniques I'm going to show you guys for wet on wet for drawing and painting 1. There are 3 other techniques. One has to do with wet on dry paint. So when you're taking on a wet on dry technique, you want to start with dry paint. Okay, so I painted this about an hour ago. It's dry. You know, I can touch it without getting my hands dirty. So you do need to be working on dry paint for this technique. The first one under wet on dry is called glazing. Now this is very simple, very easy. For this technique, I actually like to use my watercolor brush with the black bristles because it will hold a lot of water. And glazing is very simple. It is like a mini wash. So we're going to dilute the paint with water. And the whole purpose of glazing is actually just to change slightly the color of our painting. So if you go a little bit too dark and need to lighten it, you can glaze on top, or if you go a little bit too light and need to darken it, you can glaze on a darker color. Or in this case, let's say I went to red and I want it more orangey. I know that yellow and red make orange, so I can water down my yellow paint, paint it on top of the red, but I'm adding a lot of water to the paint to dilute it, which means I'm going to be able to see through the yellow. And when I see through the yellow, it's going to make my painting now look orange because the yellow and the red is mixing. So the glaze is a quick way to change the color of an object, add a little bit of a shadow. You just water down the paint, glaze it on to change the color. So you can see compared to my red, I have now my yellow orange, and my red. Okay, and that's really all that its glazing is. So short, sweet, and simple. The next technique on wet on dry, or a wet on dry technique, is called etching. Now etching is completely opposite glazing. Okay, this last technique, glazing, we watered down the paint. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to paint the paint on super thick. And I like to use my acrylic my acrylic oil brush, so the ones with the white bristles. Now I have a bunch of paint in my bristles, okay, and I'm going to glob it on. Doesn't matter the color. Okay, so I'm globbing on my blue. And then while this blue is wet, I'm going to flip my brush around backwards, use the back of the handle, and I'm going to etch. And I'm just drawing into that blue paint, and you can see when you do that, you're going to pull out or etch out that blue paint. And whatever is underneath where you etch will look red because the dry paint won't etch out, only the wet paint will. So you can get cool patterns with your etching. Sometimes people like to sign their name using that etching technique. It's totally up to you with how you want to use it, but that is one strategy you can use. And then the last strategy is actually a dry on dry technique. So again, I painted this about an hour ago. The paint is completely dry. Okay, now this technique, it's important that your brush is dry. And it's important that you're using a stiff bristled brush. So I'm using my oil acrylic brush, okay, which looks like this. You want to completely dry it off, so using your paper towel, you want to wipe out all the water, or you can just rub it on the back of your hand. Your skin will actually soak up a lot of water out of the bristles. Your skin is like a big sponge. Okay, so we're drying off the brush. Then we're going to grab a little bit of paint from our tray. Okay. But the tricky thing is this paint that I just got into the bristles from my tray is wet. Right? When paint comes out of the tube, the paint is naturally wet. So our first objective is to dry out the paint. And how you're going to do that, you're going to grab a piece of paper towel from the back of the room. And we're going to take our brush with our wet paint and we're going to start tapping. Okay, and you're going to tap on the paper towel and you're just going to tap and blop until the paint starts to look nice and soft and feathery. How do you know when you're done tapping? You're going to lightly brush your paintbrush on your hand. If no paint is coming off on your hand, you are ready to go. Okay, so that means the paint is dry in the bristles. It's almost just like dust particles inside the bristles. Then we're going to go back to our painting, which is dry, and you're going to tap that dry paint onto your artwork. And you can see it's a very light, fluffy texture, very subtle. It's exactly the same as dry brushing if you take a ceramics class. It's not a very dramatic texture, it's nice and subtle, but it works well for like sand or clouds or something that's just kind of misty and soft. Okay? You just kind of go back and forth and you can layer it up, but that is called scumbling in our paint technique. And that's the last one we're going to learn today. So those are 7 techniques you can use in your painting. You only have to use 4, so let's try all 7, practice using them, and see which ones are your favorite. Thank you.